Hello and welcome to the video. So this is the very long awaited hidden stitch wave heading video. Invisible wave heading, no-sew wave heading, whatever you want to call it, but basically it's a way of adding tape onto the back of a wave curtain without having any visible stitching on the front, so you get a really smooth, slick finish, which I think is really what wave curtain is all about. So I have all my bits here. I just happen to be making some curtains which are hidden stitch wave, so it's a perfect opportunity, and these are just lined. I will be doing another video for interlined wave heading because it's a slightly different method, but this one is just lined. You may well already have the instruction sheet that I did two sheets in fact, one with buckram and one without. The one with buckram really is for heavier weight fabrics, and indeed that's what I'm going to do on this because this is a velvet. But there's also a method without buckram, and that really just for online curtains or voiles, perfect for voiles, where there's not much weight pulling on the heading. It needs some structure inside to hold the heading nice and firm. So that's what we're about to do with this one, with the buckram. So what I have is a pair of curtains, 2.5 widths in each, in a velvet fabric, a very lovely Weems velvet, which I'll show you in a minute. And then the only other things I need are buckram, which I've got here, and I use a standard double-sided fusible buckram. You could use single-sided actually, and just stick it to one side. It doesn't actually need to stick because you're sewing it in as well, so but I find it's much easier to work with if it's ironed in, and the depth of it only needs to be the same depth as the tape, or even a tad narrower. The tape's 75mm wide, so 3 inches. This buckram is 6 inches wide, or 15 centimetres, so if you cut that in half you've got 2 3-inch pieces. And I find the best way of splitting this down the middle is to rip it. It rips so easily. Just like that. Dead easy. Very occasionally it can wander off a bit if it's not been cut perfectly to the weave. If it does, you can correct it. It doesn't really matter if one edge isn't perfect. You can use that at the bottom edge rather than the very top where you want it to be perfect. So I don't need that. Right, I will need that soon, but not immediately. So I'll just put it out of the way. And then I also have a wave tape. This one is rather nice. It's a Renaissance tape, and it has some nice features to it actually. The pockets are very close together. They're 1 centimetre apart. A tape I use more regularly is a little bit cheaper, granted. Quite a lot cheaper actually. But the pockets are a bit further spaced, so you don't have that ability to really fine-tune it like you will with this one. And it also has some markings in the weave at regular intervals. One every 12 pockets, and on the other side every 16 pockets, and that's generally to correspond with an 80mm or a 60mm wave pitch, which are the two options. I will do another video actually just on all the technicalities of fullness and wave tapes and pocket spacings and yada yada, because it isn't actually as rigid as the manufacturers make it out to be. There's a lot more leeway, and there's some nice little tips and tricks that you can use to save yourself some time for a start, and less counting of pockets and calculating of fullness. Essentially I've just made a standard pair of 2.5 width curtains. Now I use roughly a calculator of 2.2 times fullness, which is generally, they're all about 2.2, 2.1 times fullness. And then I'll just go up or down to the nearest half width, basically, or full width. This wasn't far out. It was, I think there is a bit more fullness in it, but I know I can lose that fullness when I come to hook it up. But I'll show you that at the end. And the curtain I'm working on here is, like I say, is very lovely velvet from Weems, and it's in a sand colour with a really lovely sort of silver overprint, so it's got a real nice shimmer to it. Very lovely. But it is quite heavy, it's very weighty. It's a very stable velvet actually, it's an upholstery velvet. And that makes it quite heavy. So because of that, I'm definitely going to use the buckram in the top because it needs that to support the heading because the tape's not machined on as normal. And I've made these curtains, they're actually only a short drop, just so happens, they're only 160 drop finished. But I've made them with an extra 10 centimetres at the top. What I've found over time is, whilst it's tempting actually to just, you know, leave enough fabric at the top just to turn, like you would normally for a heading tape, you know, and you only need an inch in theory just to turn over the top, and then that's covered with a tape. But because it's a wave heading, it wants to be a much more consistent, slick finish. I find that if you turn down the same depth as the buckram and the tape, that you get a much more consistent finish. You don't get any. If this was only folded over to there, say, and on a fabric like this, which is quite rigid, you get an impression of a line there, especially over time, where it's under the most pressure, where it's being waved backwards and forwards. So I find it's definitely better. It doesn't need to go any further than that. I know there's another method of making wave headings, a bit like a cuffed heading, and people generally you just use a 5-inch buckram or something, but you've got a bit of fabric below and you have to turn the fabric up as well. You've got lumpy multiple layers, which personally I prefer not to have. So yes, so I've made these 10 centimetres longer at the top. That's my allowance at the top. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure my drop, and which is 160 finished length. And pin straight through all the layers, keeping the pins nice and level. And then I used to only pin every sort of quarter width, but actually this fabric is a bit wide as well. It's a bit wider than standard, so I've started to, in more recent years shall we say, I've started to pin a bit more frequently. It takes only a moment longer and it allows for any variations that you might come across, especially on things like linens and slightly floppier fabrics. You do need to do this anyway. Less need on something like this because it's super stable. This fabric is made up beautifully actually, but it's a good habit to get in. And then I always measure on the seam, because if there is going to be any variation, it's going to be there, and so on. Just to the end, what I can get to on the table, and then I'll put the buckram in and I'll slide it across and do the other half. Okay, so now I've got my finished drop line. Now I need my buckram. And what I do so I'll use the non-ripped edge up against the pins, because that's going to eventually be my top edge, because I'm going to fold that down. I also fold the end of the buckram about 1.5 inches, 4 centimetres, something like that. And it just gives it an extra stiffener right on the very ends. And then I'm going to tuck that in between the two layers. I'm going to roughly put it in place, otherwise it just keeps dropping out. It's a pain. And then at this end, I'm going to push it down to the pin. Well, the idea is that you push it right down to the pin so that it's hard up against the pin edge. But I'm not going to take it right to the very end. I'm going to leave it short by about 5mm, something like that. So you can see there, it's short by about 5mm. And then what I do is I pull that end in like that. I sort of toe it in a bit. And then just refold the lining. And you have to ease it a bit. And the reason for that is when I fold that down, I don't want this edge to be right on the very edge there because it can tend to show. So I find it's better if it just sort of comes down a bit in from the edge. The ends of a wave curtain always fold back anyway to the wall, so it's a minor detail that you don't have to do, but I just find it's a nicer finish to not have it showing at all. And then just press that in place. Make sure that it has slipped a bit, that it is right down against the pin. So you're going to, those sort of things, we need a few hands. And then with the other hand, what I'm doing is I'm pushing down there, I'm pushing that down against the pin here. And it's important that you get that as close as you can to the pin because that becomes your finished drop. So you don't want to leave it like that, for instance, where there's a gap. It wants to be right down against the pin, like that. And then I'll just work my way along here, getting this ready while my iron's warming up. And then when you get to the seam, you might have to do a bit of wiggling just to get the buckram flap but the curtain to follow that finished drop line. And then of course keep it flat. And the better you can get it to stick, the better. The better finish you'll have. So I tend to use quite a lot of steam at this point. It depends on the fabrics you're using, of course. You have to be a little bit careful. I mean, it's pretty forgiving actually, this velvet. It's quite a short pile, but I have ironed a bit on the curtains at like the mitres and stuff to hold them down because they were pretty lumpy, and it irons really nicely. So I'm just going to go over it again. I'm just going up to the edge of the buckram here, next to those pins, and I'm not going over. There's no need to, and you're starting to stray onto the bit of the curtain that will show at the front then. And then I want to cut off this excess now, right to the edge of the buckram. So if you can't see it, I can actually see it next to the liner, but if you can't, you can run along with your nail to make a line. You can use a pencil even just to draw a line with a ruler, whatever you want, just to make sure you get a nice straight edge. Or you can, with the scissors, I can feel up against the edge of the buckram as I cut. I know I'm only cutting up against the buckram, I'm not cutting the buckram itself. Okay, so now I've done one section and I'm going to slide it across and do the other half. So I'll probably speed this up. Now I tend to just lay this in position first. So I can get the length roughly right, and then I'll rip it across just about there, so I've got this extra bit to fold. Now we can get rid of this roll because it was awkward. Oh, yes. That's right, the other head now. So same thing at this end, just make sure it's not right up to the very end, and then put a fold in it. Like that. So in fact you can see it there, look how much shorter it is. And then I can just leave that in there while I pin it. So same thing again, push it down to the pins. Nice and snug. And press. Same again, trim it back to the buckram edge. Now, there are two stages now that you may or may not need to do, and actually they both depend on the fabrics. As it happens, this has stuck really well. Now some fabrics won't stick that well. It's not perfect, so I will do it, then I can show you. I think on the instruction sheets I show turning the curtain over completely. What I did on the instruction sheets was I showed every stage in detail so that you could see all the processes and why they're done. But in practice you can skip lots of it. You don't really need to slavishly do all those individual stages, but sometimes you do. This is going to be turned down the back there. So it does want to, for now, while you're working with it, it wants to be stuck really well, because if it starts to come apart, it becomes murder to work with. I am going to overlock this as well. It's one of those things that it's not on the sheets, because I think the fabric I used at the time, it just didn't need overlocking. And many fabrics don't need overlocking. You get a nice neat cut edge, not a problem. I've just done some interlined curtains with a satin fabric, and that frayed like mad. It was murder. So that really needed doing. Plus it looks a bit scruffy on the back because the tape that covers this is a translucent tape. You can see the edge of the fabric, and if there's tatty bits of thread, and it just doesn't look very nice. So I tend to overlock most of them now, but not every one, granted. So there are two optional extra steps then. That's what we're saying is, one of them is to press from the front, and the other one is to overlock. And you may not need to do either, but the options are there, and I'm going to do it on these anyway. Now, because this is a velvet, I've got it piled down the curtain, This bit is going to be folded down the back, so it doesn't matter if I press on this, but I'm not going to go any further than that because that's what's going to be seen on the front. So I don't want to put any pressure marks on the velvet unnecessarily. I'm going to press down with the pile. Give it a bit of steam because that generates a lot more heat. It really helps to bond it. If you've got, you know, a more forgiving fabric, not a velvet basically, then you can be a bit more brutal with it than I'm being with this velvet. And the other thing you can do while you're at this point is put a guide on this side. What you're going to do is sew the tape on now. Well, in fact, the first stage is overlock this edge, but then I'm not going to bring it back to the table. I'm going to go straight to the other machine and I'm going to machine sew the tape on. But I want to put this tape right to the very edge of the buckram. And of course I can't see the buckram now because it's inside. And it so happens, because this velvet is quite a stiff velvet, it's actually quite hard to feel the edge. It's okay when it's flat on the table, but when it's on the machine it's hard to get that edge really keenly. So I'm just going to put some pins in at this point to guide me. And I'm going to put them right next to the edge of the buckram. So I can feel this quite easily. I've still got the other pins in the other side, so once I've got these in now I can take the other pins out. So I'm going to put quite a lot in so that I don't stray. It's one of those stages that looks a bit tedious, but actually it's worth it because it makes it much easier to sew. So I take those out the back and just reuse and put them in the front. Other fabrics I've just taken straight to the machine at this point, in fact, not overlocked it, and not had to repress it, and because I can feel the edge of the buckram really clearly, I've just bung the tape on dead easily. So it really just does depend on the fabric. But at least I can show you all the stages on these particular curtains because you'll know what to do then if you come across that scenario. There we go. So next thing is overlocking. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me over my cranky old machine. I'm going to overlock on the lining side just because it's a velvet, and if you do it the other way around it tends to push the velvet. I don't want to push it off the buckram. And I'm just going to overlock the very edge. There's no cutting required, although you'll probably trim off some stray fray. And just be careful because you've got these pins underneath here, so just be careful you don't drag them across your legs like I invariably do. tatty, so I'll trim off these little bits that have got caught up, but otherwise all done. So I'm going to take this straight to the other machine now and sew the tape on. Okay, so we're at the flat machine now, and what I've got on here, you may or may not be able to see this actually. On the spool I've just got a standard polyester thread, as usual. I very rarely change that. But on top I've got an invisible thread, or a monofilament thread. It's this one. Oh, there's no label on it, but I've had this forever, it seems. I think it'll probably take me forever to use it all. There's probably about 100,000 metres on there. And it's not a particularly strong thread, and it's a bit fine, but it's perfect for this translucent tape. Because what I find is, it's just all in the interest of neatness really, if you sew it with a standard thread, actually this is quite a thick one, this is a 75s I think, even with a standard on 20 thread, it still shows. And what tends to happen is you're sewing in this little weave, it's so strong, this nylon weave of the tape, it pushes the needle one way or the other, and it looks like you've done a really wonky stitch. And it just doesn't look very nice. And we need to do 2 rows, so it's worth the effort, but it's not the end of the world. If you know, it's on the back, it's one of those things that it annoys me, so these little details make a difference, I find. And what I'm going to do is start with one of these at the end. I'll use this one, and then I'll get an idea when I get to the other end where I've ended up. Hopefully I'll end up on another one of these, but so I need a bit of extra to turn, and 3 pockets is plenty, that's what I tend to, and then fold it in between the pockets, ready. And I know that this is the edge I want at the top of the tape, and I know that this spacing is the right size for the track I'm using as opposed to this side. So this is the side I'm going to put hard up against those pins. So here's the curtain all nicely overlocked. I may well knock the camera, so I apologise now. Snip off the overlocking. And then I wrap that round quite firmly, again because I'm trying to keep this edge a little bit further back, and then with the edge of the tape just above those pins. And then you want to sew right on the top edge of this tape. I find if you sew it right on the edge there, you get a much better finish than if you do sort of somewhere down here. Because what will happen, or can happen, when you've folded that over, if you've sewn here, you have a little gap here that can gape, and this over time might roll forwards. There's nothing to sort of stop it apart from the buckram inside, so it can roll forwards like that and away. It just looks, so if you keep it so right on the very edge, it stops that from happening. And the idea is that you're sewing through all the layers, just catching the very top edge of the buckram. So you want to be just underneath the pins. And then if you look at that, you can barely see that stitch line because of the monofilament. It's such a nice way of doing it. Whilst on the other side, a little big old polyester thread. But it doesn't matter because that's going to be on the inside, it's going to be sewn up, you'll never see it. So So continue on. And having these pins, rather than trying to see, on some fabrics you can, you know, if it's fine, like the satin one I did, you could see the edge of the buckram just through the fabric, and I can feel it if I do that, but it's hard to sort of keep your eye on it, and even sort of scoring a line is, if you're doing that you might as well put pins in. That's my view of it. So it's worth the effort at the table to get that nice and to get that straight line. So you're not going to be wandering off anywhere. And while I've got the opportunity, while I'm at this stage, I'm just going to see where this tape lands at the end. And amazingly, I can't believe it lands there. I swear that is more luck than judgment. I didn't measure anything, but it's finishing there. That's where it started at the other end. So I'm very lucky. So I'm just going to cut this off 3 pockets away now. You don't have to cut it now, I just find it's easier. It keeps dragging at the box. So I just missed the sewing of this. Unfortunately my camera ran out, so I'll just show you what I've got at the other end. It's just that last bit came down, and then I just managed to get it folded almost on that. Actually tapers up a bit, but that's fine because that's what we wanted it to do at the back anyway. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning again, and we're going to sew on the other side of these pockets now. And the reason for that is once this folded over, you're only going to stitch at the bottom there to the lining, and it tends to gape a little bit, this tape, against the fabric. So if you put an extra row of stitches down here, it holds it much more firm, and the pockets don't pull away from the fabric. Once you put the hooks in, it tends to pull away a little bit, see. So adding that extra stitch line makes all the difference. And what I tend to do is I just put the foot up to the edge of the the bottom of the pocket there as a guide, and you'll get a nice straight line then. Some tapes have 2 rows of pockets on one side, and if that's the case, just sew in between the 2 rows. Sometimes it can be hard to stay perfectly in line, the gap's not that big, but just favour the side to make sure that you don't sew any of the pockets up. That's all you need to avoid. So if you sew over the pockets of the row that you're not going to hook into, not a problem. So you can just whiz down this quite quickly. There we go. So you'll feel that that's much more firm now with that extra, there's no gaping. So back to the table now. And this time you can lay the curtain down the lining side. Oh! And this is the last stage, and this is folding it over and hand sewing it. So starting at one end, and what I tend to do is I sort of score down here with my nails, and it just tends to give it a neater fold somehow. Make sure the lining's up into the fold as well. And then what you should have is the top of the tape and then just a mil or 2 mil of fabric, that's all, above it, and that's all that's needed. And that's a really tight stitch line. It's not going to roll forward, it's not going to gape, it's just a really nice finish. Do need to pin this to keep it in place while you sew it. And you'll see there that this end's tapered in now, so that when that is finished, this is set back a bit so you don't see it. Whereas if it was like that, where it folds, you tend to be able to see it, just doesn't look as neat somehow. It's not imperative, it's just one of those extra little details. So make sure you've got this folded right at the top edge of the buckram. It's a little bit thicker at the end here where you've got the hem, but and then also the edge of the tape is just that a tiny bit wider because you've set it down at the top. It's just a little bit wider, which is perfect because you can just tack into the edge of the tape and into the lining. And I pin right through just to hold it while I'm sewing it. But obviously you're only going to sew and catch the lining. You're not going to sew right through. Actually, it depends on some fabrics. I have caught the front fabric just like a catchlet, just catching it on the inside without sewing right through, just a little catch stitch. But you've got to make sure you do every stitch, because if you miss one, it really shows on the front. It shows on the front where you haven't caught it. So it's a bit like locking in a Roman blind, similar sort of effect. But most fabrics you don't even need to do that. Just the lining is plenty. So I'm going to hand sew this and then move it along to the other half. But I'm going to get comfy on my stool. And the way I like to sew it is, if it's flat on the table, it's actually awkward to sew, and I find that if you pull it off the edge of the table, just like that, much easier to sew. So I've got double thread. Not worth trying to sew with a monofilament, it's just too fiddly to sew with. And it's not very strong, so best used just in the machine. And then I start by sewing up the ends. As discreetly as possible, so just a little slip stitch. The tape can be awkward to sew through, but and then when I sew along the bottom, I go through just that top layer and I come up and just catch in the edge of the tape. You can sew it any way you want really, I just find this is the easiest and it's a relatively neat way. So just through the lining layer, being careful not to catch any of the face fabric inside, up and just through the very edge of the tape, back down virtually in the same place, just the lining come up. And once you've sewn a bit, if you want, just turn it over and double check that you've not caught. What you want to see is this completely gaping away, not caught at all. So that's all hand sewing done. Now what remains is to put some hooks in it. And before I do that, I'm just going to very lightly press it. Just where I've been handling it, I've sort of pressed it with my fingers, but I'm not going to press it directly. I'm going to try cloth. Oh, there it is. I'm going to press it through a cloth. And when I press it, I'm going to be careful not to press hard over the edge of the buckram, because I don't want to create an impression that shows through. I'm just going to press it sort of here. I'm not really going to go near the edge of the buckram. And it really is just to set that top edge and make it nice and crisp. It just seems to, you know, get it all bonded together nicely. Okay, again, because it's that velvet, I'm just sort of pressing down with the pile so I don't create any marks on the velvet. There we go. So now I work out by counting the space, the pockets, where to put my hooks. And I know on the track there are 24 gliders on each side, so I need to divide this up into 24 spaces. So I count the pockets, and because I was very lucky in that it started and stopped pretty much on one of the markers, I know there's 12 pockets in each of those bottom markers, so I just need to count the markers, times it by 12 pockets. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So 30 markers. That's 12. 30 times 12 is 360 pockets, and I need to divide that up into 24. So it's 24 spaces of 15 pockets in each. Now we've got to start with a half a space for that return at each end. Now of course 15 doesn't divide into 2 very well, so at one end I'll have a space of 8 pockets, and at the other end I'll have a space of 7 pockets. And what I'll do is I'll do the opposite on each curtain, so that the 2 8 pocket ends will meet and the 2 7 pocket ends will be at the outermost, or vice versa. I'll start with 8 pockets, just because. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I want spaces of 15 pockets from now on. And I should end up with, at the other end, the last space should have 7 pockets. So 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I've worked out, because this space at the top is 16 pockets, if I work back by one each time, I don't have to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There we go. All hooked up already. And then I'm fitting these tomorrow, so I'll be able to show you them once they're hung. But basically, there's a really nice, firm, stable heading inside, really well stitched. Nothing's going to roll or gape. And once it's waving as well, it's inherently much stronger, obviously because it's now vertical. So it just tends to be much more stable once it's hanging, and it never gets a chance to flatten out because of the nature of wave. It's always being held between the hooks with the cord in the track. It's a really lovely heading. I like it. It's sort of developed to this being, for me, this being the best way to do it. I'll probably do the interline version and put that over on my Patreon because it's a little bit more advanced, and I tend to keep the more advanced methods just for the trade, really. So if you are a member of the trade, you make curtains for a living, pop on over to my Patreon if you like and have a look. There's 2 tiers, one very low value, just £1 a month, but you'll be able to see all the videos I've ever done that I put on YouTube for public viewing. You'll be able to see those ad-free. If you're a member of the Trade Pro tier, which is £5 a month plus VAT, then you'll be able to, same thing, you'll be able to watch every video I've ever made, including all the trade ones, all ad-free again. So it's worth it. I mean, there's quite a lot on there already. I think I've got over 30 videos in all, and plenty more to come as and when I do them. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, because then when I upload a new video, you'll be notified. If you hit the little bell icon as well and select notify all, I think it is, you'll get a notification then, so you won't miss anything. Thank you very much. Goodbye.